Ernest Lehman is one of the film industry's most gifted and successful screenwriters. For The Sound of Music, he did much more than adapt the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical for the screen. His enthusiasm for the story led to his personal involvement in the film's developmental stage and the search for a director. When Lehman was interviewed for our documentary, The Sound of Music from Fact to Phenomenon, the screenwriter recounted in detail his various experiences throughout the film's history. While the documentary spotlights the basics of Ernest Lehman's involvement, this audio featurette preserves his many anecdotes in comprehensive detail. Lehman began his career as a Broadway press agent and fiction writer. After some 50 of his short stories and novellas were published in national magazines, he was brought to Hollywood by Paramount Pictures in 1952 and immediately borrowed by MGM to do his first film script, Executive Suite, which was directed by Robert Wise. This was followed by success after success. Sabrina, the film version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's The King and I, Somebody Up There Likes Me, also directed by Robert Wise, after which he co-wrote the screen version of his own novella, Sweet Smell of Success. In 1958, he wrote the quintessential Alfred Hitchcock film North by Northwest at MGM, then returned to Fox for From the Terrace. Another happy reunion with Robert Wise followed, with West Side Story being the result. Despite this unbroken string of hits, Lehman has never claimed to possess any secret formula to good writing.
You know, I really don't know how I know anything as a screenwriter. I had never written a musical when 20th Century Fox decided that I should be the screenwriter of The King and I. I had never even seen The King and I. I had to go back to New York to see it. Oscar Hammerstein met with me and told me he had seen Executive Suite at Radio City Music Hall. I was very impressed with it. Because look, Darryl Zanuck had to say yes to me. He was the head of the studio. Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein had to say yes to me. And I had never written a musical. And I had, in fact, had only 2 pictures on the screen when I did The King and I. Now, there was a Broadway director named Vincent Donahue who was signed by Paramount Pictures and brought out to the coast on contract, and they were looking for a property for him to direct. So one of the executives at the studio screened a German film made by Wolfgang Reinhardt based on an autobiography of Maria von Trapp. When the picture ended, it was a German film, Vincent Donahue turned to the executive and said, "You've got to do me a big favor. Don't do anything with this picture. Let me take it back to New York. I think it would make a great Rodgers and Hammerstein musical for Mary Martin." So Paramount let Vincent Donahue take this back to New York. He brought it to Rodgers and Hammerstein and Leland Hayward, and that's how it came into being, with a book by Howard Lindsay and Russell Krauss, directed by Vincent Donahue. Vincent directed the stage musical. Now, I am in New York doing research for another movie with my wife, and I go to see this musical in its second week. It had gotten beaten around the ears by the New York critics. At the intermission, my wife and I went to a nearby Howard Johnson's to get a bowl of clam chowder. And I said to her, "I don't care what the critics say about this show. Someday it's going to make a very successful movie." When I got back to the coast, I told my good friend, who was sort of second in command to the head of the studio, my good friend David Brown, that I had seen The Sound of Music and thought that someday it was going to make a very successful movie. At a preview, David Brown took me over to the head of the studio, Buddy Adler, and said, "I want you to repeat to Buddy what you said to me about The Sound of Music, because we had an option on that property and we've bought it." So I told Buddy what I had said, the second week I saw the show, that someday that's going to make a very successful movie. Dissolved to a year or two later, I don't know the exact calendar here, but Buddy Adler is gone, had died of a brain tumor. Cleopatra was shooting overseas. The studio was virtually closed down. But somehow they had all remembered, passed down from studio head to studio head, that I once said The Sound of Music would make a very successful movie. And I am suddenly approached to write the screenplay of The Sound of Music.
Lehman was officially signed on December the 20th, 1962. After Christmas, he prepared to move on to the 20th Century Fox studio lot.
When it was announced that I was signed to write the screenplay, Richard Zanuck was in a little bungalow. He didn't even have an office. I called the studio manager and I said, "Now, what office can I have?" And he said, "What office do you want?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean, what office do you want? You can have any office in the place." And he led me through the studio chief's office, the head of the story department's office, everybody's office, all deserted. And I could have had any of them. It's the same as someone calling up and saying, "What time does the picture go on?" And the manager says, "What time can you get here?" And I picked out a small office in the production department of the studio, and that's where I wrote the screenplay of The Sound of Music.
In the first week of 1963, Lehman began preliminary discussions for The Sound of Music with Richard Zanuck.
First, I insisted that I write the publicity release announcing that I had been signed to do the picture. In writing this release, I described Dick as vice president in charge of production for 20th Century Fox. He had had no official position at that time. His father, based at the Hotel St. Regis in New York, had taken over 20th Century Fox in a proxy battle, and he had placed his son in that bungalow to run what was left of the studio. So I sort of officially titled Dick vice president in charge of production. And this made banner headlines in both trade papers. And Dick and I met for lunch at Romanoff's to talk about the project. He didn't get to my table directly because he was accosted by Irving Swifty Lazar, famous agent. I watched them as they talked for about 5 minutes, and then finally Dick shook his head, walked away from Lazar, and came over to my table and sat down. He said, "You know what just happened? Irving Lazar, on behalf of an unnamed client, just offered me a $750,000 profit if I would turn over the property, The Sound of Music, to him." And I told him no. I said, "That's great news. I wonder who it could be." We speculated, but we didn't come up with any names. When I got back to my office, the phone rang. It was Irving Lazar. He said, "Ernie, what are you doing over there working on The Sound of Music? They're kidding you. They're never going to make that picture. They have no money. You'll never even get paid." I said, "Irving, you just offered Dick Zanuck a profit of $750,000 for the property, and he said no." Lazar kept right on talking. I started trying to find a director for the picture, or a producer director. So I called Stanley Donen in Switzerland and said, "Stanley, would you be interested in directing The Sound of Music? I'm working on a screenplay." He said, "Ernie, I'm an investor in the show. That's enough for me. Thanks, but no thanks." Okay? I then visited Gene Kelly at his home in Beverly Hills at night and pleaded with him to direct The Sound of Music. He led me out the front door, and on the front lawn he said, "Go find someone else to direct this piece of shit." The great Billy Wilder At Jack Lemon's house, Billy Wilder came over to me and said, "Ernie, I hate to say this to you, but no musical with a swastika in it can ever be a success."
On January the 14th, Richard Zanuck and Lehman went to New York. Upon their arrival, Zanuck met with his father, and Lehman attended a screening of the German-language film, The Trapp Family, after which he picked up a copy of Maria von Trapp's book, The Story of the Trapp Family Singers. The next day, his consultation with the younger Zanuck continued.
The first thing Dick and I did was to go to see the show. I hadn't seen it in, I think, 2 years. Mary Martin was long gone from the show, and I was committed to this now. I remember sitting there and watching the show and thinking, this is what I have agreed to make as a movie. This is what I said 2 years ago was someday going to be a successful movie. And when it was over, Dick and I sort of weren't talking to each other as we walked out of the theater. We were in deep dismay. Now, it's one thing to say, this is going to make a great movie someday. It's another thing to know that you're now committed to doing it. So we met with Darryl and started talking about casting, talking about directors. All we've got is this writer. And I said, what about the greatest director in the world, Willy Wyler? And Darryl said, that's not a bad idea. When you get back to California, why don't you see if he's interested? I said, wait a minute, why don't you call him right now? Maybe he has seen the play and hated it, or maybe he's not available, or maybe he's not interested. So Darryl called Willy Wyler, and Willy said, tell Ernie to stay there. I'll fly to New York and see the show with him. So that's what we did. Dick went back to California. I waited in New York, and I visit my old friend Richard Rogers to tell him that I'm working on The Sound of Music. And he said, I suppose you're going to use Doris Day. And I said, no way. There's only one person who can do this role, and that's Julie Andrews. He gave me a sour look and said, so what else is new? To me, it was so obvious that she would bring something to the role that it needed. Mary Martin was fine, but I had seen it with other actresses on the stage, and I just felt Julie was perfect. I loved her in My Fair Lady on the stage. I loved her in the Rodgers and Hammerstein television special, Cinderella. Doris Day's husband, believe it or not, came into my office and tried to sell me Doris Day.
Ironically, Darryl Zanuck had also favoured Doris Day for the role of Maria. Her latest film, Move Over Darling, had just been completed at Fox and looked like a hit. But Lehman and the Zanucks were not immediately concerned with casting, but with signing a director. And William Wyler, director of such classics as Wuthering Heights, Mrs. Miniver, The Best Years of Our Lives, and Ben-Hur, was a 3-time Oscar winner and one of the foremost directors in motion pictures. He was also a close friend of Darryl Zanuck, and had accepted Zanuck's invitation to sit on Fox's board of directors when the studio reopened. On January the 17th, Wyler came to New York to meet with Lehman.
I took him to see the show. This is the 3rd time now. Darryl was waiting for us at 21 to meet with us after we saw the show. And as I'm walking out of the theater with Willie, he said, Ernie, I hate to tell you this, but I hated this show. I hate this show, and I'm not going to meet Darryl. I can't meet Darryl. I said, you have to. He's waiting for us. So we got in the car. The car drives us to 21, and Willie refused to get out of the car. So I told the chauffeur to go in and tell Darryl that we were not going to meet with him. So Willie said, let's go for a walk. So Willie and I started walking the streets of Manhattan. It's late at night, and all he keeps saying is, Ernie, I can't tell you how much I hated this show, but please, keep telling me why you think it's going to make a movie and why you think I ought to do it. So I said, I've just got one question to ask you, Willie. Remember the moment where the captain starts singing The Sound of Music with his children? He said, yeah, it's funny you bring up that moment. He said, you know, I almost cried. I said, that's it, Willie. That's why this is going to make a very successful movie. That moment. And I think it expresses an unconscious longing on the part of all humans who wish that they could feel closer to their parents, or parents feeling they wish they could feel closer to their children, or get closer to each other. It expressed a universal longing and a kind of fulfillment of it in that scene. And he said, keep talking. So the next day, I reported to Darryl Zanuck that Willie hated the show, but he wants me to keep talking to him. So Darryl said, okay, your job is not to work on the screenplay. Your job is to stay with Willie Wyler and keep talking to him and keep twisting his arm until he agrees to do the movie. So it took me 2 weeks to talk Willie. We flew back to California together, and I keep talking to him, and finally he agreed to do the movie. But somehow I have my doubts about Willie Wyler. I had known Willie Wyler for many years, and in fact I had turned down several projects that he wanted me to do with him. I had turned them down simply because I didn't believe in them. But Willie was known to kind of make deals all over town and change his mind, and you never knew where he really meant it or didn't mean it. And all I could remember was that he had hated this show, and yet I had talked him into saying yes. So I had slight doubts.
Wyler brought in associate producer Roger Eatons, an acclaimed musical supervisor who had worked on Meet Me in St. Louis, Annie Get Your Gun, and many other films at MGM. Lehman began working with Eatons on January the 31st, beginning by screening the film version of The King and I. Then they turned their attention to Lehman's preliminary treatment for The Sound of Music.
I had an outline. So the first thing we decided to do was go to Salzburg. I had to see Salzburg and see how I could turn this into a movie. What I saw was on a stage. Willie didn't come there at first. I went with Roger Eatons, and my wife joined us, and we floated all over this beautiful place, and I saw all its beautiful scenery and thought of many, many places where filming could take place. And then Willie arrived, and we did a lot of locale hunting, a lot of research. And at one point, Willie decided that he and Roger Eatons, his associate producer, and I should hire a private plane and fly over the Alps to see everything from the air. And I said, I'm a screenwriter. I'm not going up in a little private plane over the Alps. And he said, you've got to. I said, why have I got to? He said, because I'm the producer and I'm ordering you to. I refused. I later found out that when he got up in the plane, he discovered that the pilot had been a Nazi. And he fought bitterly with the pilot all during the flight. And Roger Eatons told me they almost crashed at one point. The fighting was so bitter. Anyway, I never went up in the air. Never floated over Salzburg or the Swiss Alps. Now, while I'm there in Salzburg, Willie seems to be calling Hollywood a lot. And I keep telling him that I see Julie Andrews for the role of Maria, and Willie is adamant in telling me that he wants either Audrey Hepburn or some unknown actress. But Willie was hard of hearing, and he was making long-distance telephone calls to producer Martin Ranzerhoff at MGM from a phone booth in the lobby of our hotel, and he couldn't hear Marty, so he had me take over the phone And I realized that what was going on was that Willie was negotiating to direct a picture called The Americanization of Emily at MGM, sort of feeding my doubts about his real interest in the sound of music.
Location scouting took place from May 27th through June 10th, with photographs and notes taken by Roger Edens.
Finally, we cover all the locations. I pick out spots that I think can work. We go back to California, and I'm left alone, and I confer with Dick Zanuck, and I say, listen, Dick, I'm worried about Willie, because in his office I see a stack of books about a mile high, and they're all about the Anschluss. This picture is really not all that much about the Anschluss. I think that's all Willie's interested in, is sort of making an anti-Nazi musical. What's more, he's negotiating with MGM to do the Americanization of Emily, which is going to start shooting pretty soon. He said, you know what, we have to smoke Willie out. You've got to write this first draft very fast. I said, I can't write a fast screenplay. He said, you've got to write it so fast that we find out whether Willie is really serious about making this picture. Now I'm working on the screenplay, and I'm seated all by myself in the commissary, and a couple of tables away, there's Burt Lancaster, with whom I had made The Sweet Smell of Success almost a decade earlier. And Burt sees me seated there, and he said, Ernie, what are you doing here? I said, I'm writing the screenplay of The Sound of Music. And he said, Jesus, you must need the money. That was quoted in the New York Times in bold-faced type. So I wrote that first draft as fast as I could. And I finished it and handed it in to Willie. And he called me up right away. And he said, Ernie, I'm embarrassed. I've never read such a wonderful first draft screenplay. I can't think of a single suggestion to make. So I hung up the phone and I called Dick Zanuck. I said, Dick, we're in trouble. Willie's not going to make this picture. There's no such thing as Willie not being able to make suggestions. He eats writers alive. In fact, the previous writer on a picture I had turned down suffered a heart attack while he was writing the picture with Willie and had to be wheelchaired and wound up back in Maine, John Michael Hayes, on the Children's Hour. Then I got a phone call from Willie Wyler saying he's having Rex Harrison and Rachel Roberts over to his Malibu house on the weekend. Would I please come over and talk Rex Harrison into playing the role of Captain Von Trapp? And I said, Willie, I'm just the writer. Why do you want me to talk to Rex Harrison? I don't know Rex Harrison. He said, he'll be more convinced if it comes from you. So I arrived at Willie's house. There's Rex Harrison, Rachel Roberts, Willie, and Willie's wife, Tally. And in a corner of the property is Mike Frankovich, the head of Columbia Pictures. And his wife, Binnie Barnes, was seated with the rest of us, but Mike Frankovich and Willie Wyler were in a huddle, that's the only word I can call it, off in a corner of the property, and they were talking for about a half hour. I went into the water with Rex Harrison, made my pitch about why he'd be perfect for Captain Von Trapp, etc., etc. But all the time I was watching Willie with the head of Columbia Pictures. So when we got out of the water, dried myself off, I went into Willie's house. There was nobody in there but me. Every place you looked, there were scripts. There were scripts. Everybody had been submitting scripts to Willie. And I looked at the titles of all the scripts because they were lying face up. And then I came upon one script, and it was lying face down. You couldn't see the title. So I turned it over. It said, The Collector, a Columbia Picture. So I turned it back over. And when I went home, I called Dick Zanuck at home. And I said, Dick, Willie Wyler is going to direct The Collector. Be ready. So he said, okay. A couple of days later, Willie Wyler sent his agent in to see Dick Zanuck and asked Dick to postpone The Sound of Music so that he could make The Collector, and he would then come back and make The Sound of Music. So Dick said, you tell your client, he said this to the agent, Paul Kohner, he said, you tell your client that I won't postpone this picture 30 seconds. Tell him to go make The Collector. He wound up not making the Americanization of Emily or The Sound of Music, but he made The Collector. I had recalled seeing Bob Wise sitting morosely in the commissary at 20th Century Fox. He had turned down this picture about a year ago before anything had been done because he felt it was too saccharine. He was going to make The Sand Pebbles in Taipei, but there was a monsoon, and his picture was postponed. So he was seated in the commissary with nothing to do. So I called his agent, Phil Gersh. I said, Phil, I'm sending a copy of the screenplay of The Sound of Music over to you. Would you please give it to Bob Wise? He said, Ernie, Willie Wyler is going to do The Sound of Music. I said, don't ask any questions. Just give the script to Bob Wise. I later found out that Bob got the script, read it, was impressed enough to send a copy of it over to Saul Chaplin, who had been his associate producer on West Side Story, and asked Saul what he thought of it, and had said to Saul, if you say yes, I'll say yes. So they both said yes. I heard this later. My phone rings. It's Dick Zanuck. He said, come on down. I went down to his office. And he said, I've got a surprise for you. What would you say if I told you that I could get Bob Wise to direct this picture? And I said, great. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, you son of a bitch, you slipped him the script, didn't you? And I said, me? Never. That's how Bob Wise wound up doing The Sound of Music. Bob Wise and Saul Chaplin came on a picture where there was a screenplay, and they both liked the screenplay, but they had to play catch-up. I had been on the picture for a half year. So 20th Century Fox sent me on a vacation. They sent me on leave. I think I went to the desert for a month while Saul and Bobby and I guess Zuby went to Salzburg to look for all these locations that Ernie had written into the screenplay. And the running gag was that I had put Maria in a place that I had described was verdant, V-E-R-D-A-N-T. So the running gag among that group was, let's go find Ernie's verdant. They kept looking all over Salzburg for Ernie's verdant. So when they came back, now we were a team together, and Bob had his suggestions as to how I could revise the screenplay. So I sat in my office, closed my eyes, and looked down at my dark lids and envisioned an opening for the film. Perhaps influenced by our opening of West Side Story, okay? And I described, using the first person singular, exactly what I wanted to see on the screen, what I wanted to hear, and much to my amazement, and I think Bob Wise is one of the few directors in the world who somehow has great respect for a screenwriter's idea if it's a good one. His tendency is to go in the direction the screenwriter has suggested. On previous Bob Wise pictures, I'm astonished when I see that what I wrote is up there on the screen. The opening of Somebody Up There Likes Me, for example. It's just a very surprising thing to happen to a screenwriter. So you have to be very careful what you write if Bob is going to direct the picture. And I can't recall specifically all the wonderful suggestions he made to me to improve the screenplay of The Sound of Music as it progressed from its first draft to its revised final draft. When the picture came out, I thought it was going to be clobbered completely by My Fair Lady, which had a tremendous aura of success about it. And I felt that The Sound of Music was going to die. By this time, I was over at Warner Brothers producing and writing my first production, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, while Sound of Music was being shot. First time I saw it was at the premiere in Los Angeles. At the intermission, I realized that I then knew who the unknown client was that had asked Irving Swifty Lazar to buy the property from Dick Zanuck, because there was Jack Warner, the head of Warner Brothers, at the intermission in the lobby, bad-mouthing The Sound of Music in a loud voice. And I realized, of course, he had wanted the picture for himself, and this picture was going to be a threat to his musical, My Fair Lady. And suddenly there came a day where somebody called me and said, "We think this picture is going to be a hit." And I said, "You're kidding." Dissolve 2, the Directors Guild, is a screening of The Sound of Music. And it's a huge hit. Seated in front of me is Willie Wyler with his wife and children. And he turns around and he taps me on the knee. He said, "Well, Ernie, I guess I made a mistake, didn't I?" He said, "But one thing you got to admit, I got you Julie Andrews." Willie Wyler was so upset that he decided to make a musical. That's why Willie Wyler directed Funny Girl, because he had lost out on The Sound of Music. And suddenly it became apparent to everybody that this picture was like a phenomenon. Nobody dreamt this would happen. I keep seeing that picture and thinking, how did Bob make it all so perfect? You know, everything is framed so beautifully, and the people are playing it as good as it can be played. And it's beautiful. It's well acted. It's beautifully photographed. The scenery is magnificent. It's a fairy tale that's almost real. It gives people hope about life. And I have a hunch that this picture may be watched in some way, shape, or form, or experienced in some way, shape, or form 1,000 years from now.